Hello and welcome back to the Gist-ory channel. My name's Dave and it's good to have you here. We're back for episode 5 of our story of Britain and we'll be going through the medieval period, the time of the Plantagenet Kings of England. First and foremost, I have to say, I'm not a historian, I'm not a professor, I'm not an academic, I'm just an enthusiast. I'm just a regular fella with a love of history and a love of a good tale. I might get a few details wrong, might miss a nuance or two, might get my facts muddled up, but one thing's for sure, here at the Gist-ory channel, you might not get the whole story, but we can definitely give you the gist. So we've got a lot to get through. We've got a boatload of Henrys and a whole lot of Edwards, and maybe a Richard and a John thrown in there as well, as we'll be going through the whole medieval period and the whole reign of the Plantagenet Kings of England. Last episode, we went through the anarchy of England, where Matilda and Stephen fought for the English throne. Stephen, the King of England, is dead, but long live the King, King Henry II, is our first Plantagenet King of England. Now, Plantagenet was the nickname given to his father, Geoffrey of Anjou. And why? Because he wore a sprig of bloom in his hat when he was in the French court. And the French king nicknamed him Plantagenet, which means sprig of bloom because he wore the yellow flower in his hat. And that is what the family becomes known as, the flower hat people. But Plantagenet sounds a lot better. So we start off with Henry II. He's come out of a massive anarchy in England, so his first order of business with his beautiful, famous wife, the former Queen of France, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is the Duchess of one of the most powerful duchies in the whole of France. He must rule both England and most of France. They are probably the biggest players on the European stage, but he has to hold on to all of that. He doesn't want another anarchy. So what he decides to do is to firm up his control of England and France. And the way that he does that is by stamping his authority down on England. And one of his first acts is to introduce what we know as common law, the law of the land, laws that survive and up to this day. Because what would happen in England before common law was all the lords who ruled over different parts of England would settle disputes between their subjects on their own. So if you had a problem, you went to your lord, he decided for you or against you. Or if you did something against your lord, he might be a really harsh person and might lop your hands off, or he might fine you, or he might let you off entirely. He might have his own biases. It was all different up and down the land. So what Henry decided to do was introduce common law, a law of the land. And that's where we get circuit judges. So the king's representative would be available to settle disputes in the name of the king, to use royal authority. So that's when you get courts, where the judge who represents the king presides over, and you have a jury, local people in that area that the judge travels to hear the dispute. And the jury, because they know the local people, they're from among the local people, can decide whether to give a guilty or a not guilty verdict. And this replaced the previous system where there were all kinds of ways of deciding if you were guilty or not, including, for fans of Game of Thrones, trials by combat or even trials by ordeal. Now, from the common law system, we get a definition of serious offences. Murder is common law. Robbery is common law. Treason, forgery, rape's common law. All these things that were debatable previously, there are set sentences for these things. There are set punishments for these things. And it's all in the name of the king. It's all designed to keep the power with the king. Now, King Henry is a really effective ruler, even though he does stamp his authority over everything, because he's helped by one of his best friends, Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket has grown up, an educated man. He learns law. He goes to be a clerk in the priesthood. He is a great companion of Henry. The thick as thieves. They're described at one point as being of one heart and one mind. And Henry appoints him, when he becomes king, his chancellor, which is his right-hand man. He solves all his disputes for him. He goes on big diplomatic missions. And he's known as being really ruthless, really hard-nosed, but all 100% the king's man. And he'll be serious in his job, but he'll come out drinking at the end of the day, and they were all best buds, and it was all going to be happy forever and a day. And then a position comes up as to who's going to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the highest church position in England. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the position that authorises the crowning of kings. And it is the representative, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the representative of the Pope in England. The Pope is the vicar of Christ, the representative of Christ on earth. So the importance of the Archbishop of Canterbury can't be understated. And Henry thinks, well, if I have my best bud, Thomas Becket, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, he can get all sorts of favours from Rome. He can keep me in good favour with the Pope. We're going to be absolutely laughing on a global scale, not just in Europe. We're going to be worldwide. So he appoints him as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And everything's smooth sailing until there's a few questions that arise. For example, Thomas Becket doesn't answer to Henry anymore. He answers to the Pope, who answers to God. So if Henry is wanting to try someone who's a member of the church, traditionally, the church, the Archbishop, gets to decide what happens to members of the clergy. And so the king would be like, one of your priests is getting tried in my courts. Thomas would be like, no, he's not. He's getting tried in my court. Henry would be like, Thomas, I'm the king. Remember, we're best buds, but I'm in charge. Thomas is like, you're not my boss anymore. The Pope is. Some clashes start to emerge. Because the issue is that the church is so powerful in this day and age. When William the Conqueror invaded and gave all the land away to his preferred people, he kept a fifth of it for himself, divided a load of it amongst his loyal supporters and raised them to be the most important people in the kingdom. So why the French and the Normans dominated the elites. But he gave a quarter of the entire land of England to the church. So that's a quarter of the kingdom, who the Archbishop of Canterbury is effectively the landlord of. So any taxes that come from those lands go to the church. Any tolls or bridges or fees that are due for those lands all go to the church. All of the peasantry owe what's called a tithe automatically to the church, which is 10% of everything that you farm. So if you're farming, 10% of it, your tithe has to go to the church. Also, the church will encourage people to donate money to them for their souls to be higher regarded, to be prayed for. The church can also sell you indulgences. So if you've done something wrong, there's a price for your soul. You pay some money, they can have a word, and your soul gets cleared somewhat of the sin. And there was also this issue that they ran their own courts. So there were priests and part of the clergy that would commit crimes that would go against the king's common law, but they would demand to be tried by the church, by Thomas à Becket's church. And this infuriated Henry because people would try and pretend that they had a link to the church. It was called benefit of the clergy. You could say, I'm training to be a priest, and someone, or my family, there is a priest in my family, so that we do have a link to the church. So can I be tried for this crime that you've got me up for in the church? And some people would say, well, you have to prove that you're part of the church, and the best way to prove that is only the elites and the clergymen, the church people, know how to read. So do you know any passages that you can prove that you can read? And people would memorize parts of the Bible to say, the meek shall inherit the earth. Well, obviously you won't know that unless you could read. Absolutely, we'll try you in an ecclesiastical court, a church court. And if you were going to be tried, you wanted it to be in a church court because if you got tried by the laws of the land, your punishments could range from getting clapped in irons and getting hung upside down in a prison somewhere to getting your hands cut off, to getting all sorts of stuff cut off, to getting flogged. It were the punishments were absolutely tortured. You name it, the worst punishments you can imagine. You get tried in a church court, and they'll say you have to pay penance, which is like public confession or apology at mass, or you'd have to flog yourself, or you'd have to go on pilgrimage. They'd force you to go on pilgrimage to holy sites. Or I mean, some of the worst things that could happen to you is you could be imprisoned in the bishop's prison, which is even better than when royals got imprisoned. But also, you could make an oath in front of a church court and say, I am not guilty. I'm giving you my oath. And it's called purgation. And if you could find 12 people to say, absolutely, Bill over there, he is 100% innocent, they'll let you off because they took your word for it. So if you're going to get tried, you're going to want it to be in a church court. And Henry II having none of it. And he's arguing back and forth with Thomas Becket, who's taking his job massively seriously now. Henry feels betrayed because he's like, I put you in this position to help me, not to, make things harder for me. And you're not going to listen to a word I say. I'm trying to build my authority up in England. And he keeps saying, my authority is not to you. It's to God. It's to the Pope. It's serve a higher power now. So it all comes to a head. Henry is falling out with everybody. He falls out with his family. He's got quite a few sons, and his eldest son is also called Henry. And what he does is to stop anything like the anarchy happening, he does something unprecedented, and he crowns his own son before he's died. So he crowns him the King of England. So there's no dispute. It's as soon as that it's already settled. But what he does is he says to his son, "I've crowned you king, but you're not getting any lands. You're literally king in name only." And he gives his brothers, Geoffrey gets to be the Duke of Brittany in France. His other son, Richard, who will become very influential, becomes Duke of Aquitaine, which is his mother's, or will become Duke of Aquitaine, which is his mother's lands. And John, who's the youngest, he doesn't inherit many lands, but he gets something as well. Henry's left with nothing, the eldest son, and he's fuming about it. But the bigger problem that Henry faces is it's the Archbishop of Canterbury who has to crown and coronate kings. And Henry has bypassed Thomas, and he's got the Archbishop of York to do it. So Thomas Becket says, right, that's it then. I'm excommunicating, which means I'm absolutely banishing forever. Your soul is damned. You're out of the church, gone. In the eyes of God, you're an absolute heathen. You are excommunicated from the Catholic Church. I am excommunicating every bishop that was involved in that, the Archbishop of York, everyone who was there at that crowning of that young prince to say he's the King of England. So technically we've got two kings of England, but King Henry II, the one who's sitting, is not giving up any power. And things get very dangerous for Thomas Becket. He's already had to flee the country before because things are getting hot and heavy for him. And when Henry II hears the news that Thomas Becket has started excommunicating bishops in his own land for decisions he's made, undermining his authority, he has all his court around him, and he gets told the news. He's excommunicated these bishops, and he says the immortal words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Now, we don't know in what context he said that, whether it was just an outburst, whether he was saying, will someone please back me up against this Thomas Becket, who has been a pain in my arse ever since I elected him as Archbishop? Because the thing is, if you upset the church, especially the Archbishop of Canterbury, he can turn population against you because every Sunday people are at church. You put things in there, the king needs to mend his ways and come back to the Lord, and hopefully he will one day. You can easily get people on side because they are more scared of God than they are of their king, as fearsome as King Henry II was. So what happens? Henry II says, will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? And he leaves it. Court finishes. but there's loads of people who were there and heard him with this outburst. And 4 knights take it upon themselves. This was in Normandy that he heard the news, because obviously he's got a massive empire. They go across to England. They go to Canterbury. They go to Canterbury Cathedral, and they find Thomas of Becket. He's sometimes called Thomas a Becket. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is in Canterbury Cathedral, and they enter the cathedral. Now, bearing in mind it's the house of God, and under no circumstance, people can claim sanctuary in the house of God, even in these times. No violence can happen because it is in the house of God. No blood can be shed. And they enter the house of God fully armed, and they basically demand of him, you need to withdraw your excommunications of the king's bishops and archbishops right now. And I don't know who they thought they were messing with, but Thomas Becket's used to defying the king, and he must have turned around to him saying, I hope you know what you're doing here. There's no way I'm withdrawing anything. And they start to get frustrated. Obviously, they're not probably lords themselves, they're not used to hearing no. And so they start getting frustrated, demanding, you need to do the right thing here. Thomas Becket's saying, absolutely not. And you'll hear more of this. Basically, you can't unfortunately, you can't put the cork back in the bottle now. You've just threatened the Archbishop of Canterbury, probably its second most powerful person in the whole kingdom. And so they start getting rough with him, try to put him under arrest to bring him to Henry. Thomas Becket resists. The swords come out. One thing's led to another, and they end up hacking him to death. They murder the Archbishop of Canterbury in Canterbury Cathedral, in the house of God, the house of God in England. I mean, what a shockwave that must have been throughout the whole of what was called Christendom. So, Western Europe. And they flee, realizing what they've done. Oh, God, what have we done? Go back to Henry, report it. Can you imagine that scene? Well, can we have an audience, Your Grace? What do you want? Well, we kind of did what you said. What do you mean? And you did what I said? Well, and you said, can you rid me of that turbulent priest? When were that? And he's like, well, it was Thomas Becket. He says, I'm always kicking off about Thomas Becket. What do you mean you did what I wanted? Well, when you said that, you wanted to get rid of him, didn't you? He says, well, I might have done, but, I don't know what to do about it. So you didn't mean hack him to death in Canterbury Cathedral? You what? Can you imagine his reaction? Are you kidding me? So after this, the fallout from this, the 4 knights go on the run. They eventually get found, claim that they thought they were doing what Henry asked. So they get tried by the church and by the Pope, and the Pope demands that they go on pilgrimage for the next 14 years. Henry is forced to do public penance, ask for forgiveness in public in front of everyone. In 1172, the Pope banned him from Mass. You're not allowed to go to church until you do this. So the murder of Thomas Becket happens in 1170. In 1172, he does public penance at Avaranches Cathedral. But no one trusts him anymore. And in 1173, his chickens are coming home to roost because his eldest son, who he's humiliated, by the way, not giving any lands and tries giving his inheritance to his favourite son, John, the youngest, tries giving his castles away that he's due to inherit. Henry says, I'm not having that. The young son, Henry, says, I'm not having that, and I'm rebelling against you. And he's backed by France and Scotland and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, because Henry II, not only does he go about saying things that get archbishops of Canterbury killed, but he also likes hopping into the bed of the first girl who flutters her eyelashes at him. His powerful, beautiful former Queen of France, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who's got probably the most powerful duchy in France, encourages her sons to rebel against him because he's trying to elbow her out. He's trying to get everything consolidated for himself. And so the sons are all against him, particularly her favourite son, Richard, who becomes the Duke of Aquitaine. King Henry II ends up winning this rebellion against his heir, Henry, and he pardons his sons, but imprisons Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, if there's going to be anything that's going to wind up your sons more, it's imprisoning your mother, who's she supports them, whereas he lords over the fact that he's the king. and he's got this horrible reputation for killing Thomas Becket, which, I mean, this is what makes history fascinating. It's for you to decide. Did he want someone to go take it upon themselves to kill Thomas Becket? Was it just a frustrated outburst? Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? It's for you to decide. That's why history's brilliant. Henry, the heir, he dies. He dies in 1183, followed by Geoffrey, the other brother, in 1186. Henry, the next in line for the throne, he died of the bloody flux, which is dysentery. It's like bloody diarrhea. It's due to bad hygiene. A lot of people died of that in these days. He was 28. And the brother Geoffrey, he died in a riding accident. He was at a tournament in Paris. He got some injuries and he died of that, which made the third in line for the throne the first. And this would be Richard, who would become Richard the First. Now, he is the Duke of Aquitaine. He's got the backing of the King of France, Philip II, and he rises up one last time against his father, Henry II, in 1189. And father and son go to war. The son is backed by the King of France. And not only that, Henry II, he's fighting to disinherit Richard because Richard's all for his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor and Henry II now hate each other. And Henry II wants to make his favourite child, John, the youngest, the heir to the throne. But in a cruel twist of fate, Richard ends up winning the battle. And Henry, as he's riding away from the battle, manages to escape. He's very ill at this point. He finds out the news that John, his youngest, who's always the schemer, always plotting, he backed the winning horse. He joined Richard at the last minute, which doesn't mean he was on Richard's side, but he knew where his bread was buttered and knew where the best advantage would be, because it was the writing seemed to be on the wall that Richard was going to win. And then Henry dies the same year, 1189. He dies probably of a broken heart. His family abandoned him, the church rejected him, and the first of the Plantagenet kings is dead. But long live the king, King Richard the First. Now, Richard had been dying to become the king because he'd been dying to go on the Third Crusade. The First Crusade in 1095 was to take Jerusalem, the holy city. The Second Crusade was to retake Edessa, which is in the Holy Land. It's in the area where Jerusalem is, but it had fallen to the Turks. And the Second Crusade was a failure. They didn't manage to retake Edessa. They were going for all sorts of targets. They ended up going after Damascus, which were more of an ally to the Crusaders, because in the First Crusade, they'd managed to set up the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was having Western Knights permanently settle in the Middle East, which was like a combination of all the different nationalities of people who went there. So you had English, you had French, you had German, and this is where you get the different orders of knights, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, the Holy Orders. They all came from the Holy Land. But for the Third Crusade, Richard was itching to go because the Second Crusade had been considered a bit of a failure. And the reason for the Third Crusade was in 1187, Saladin, who was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had retaken Jerusalem. Jerusalem had surrendered to him. So the Western Europeans who were there, if you've ever seen Kingdom of Heaven, this shows how Saladin or Salahuddin retook the city of Jerusalem. And right at the end of Kingdom of Heaven, there's a rider that comes up to Orlando Bloom and says, "I'm going on a crusade. Will you join me, great Sir Knight?" It's Orlando Bloom's playing Balian of Ibelline. And he says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am Richard, King Richard." And this is what happened. King Richard is going to the Holy Land with the King of France, Philip II, to retake Jerusalem from Saladin, the great Sultan. And he'd been prevented from doing this because his father, Henry II, was always fighting with him. So as soon as he becomes king, he puts a massive tax on everybody and he marches off to the Crusades, where, it must be said, he makes his name. He becomes Richard the Coeur de Lion, which is French for the Lionheart. And that's because he carries a banner into battle which has 3 lions on it, which will come to represent England. The two lions had been used for years for the House of Normandy, but he adds the third lion, or his father had added the third lion, to represent the Plantagenet kings. And he has some right success. There's a siege of a great city called Acre in the Middle East, which is called Outremer by the Western Crusaders, which means land beyond the sea. And this siege has been going on for years, for ages. And he comes, properly organises it, retakes the city. And the French hate this. The French king hates it because King Richard is probably the greatest warrior king there is. And the praise and the adoration that he gets from not only the church, but from the whole of Christendom, from the whole of his subjects. It just seems everything he touches turns to gold. He defeats the mighty Saladin, who is a hugely capable battle commander, who's a very respected enemy. He's very kind to his enemies. He's very benevolent. The warrior of Islam. He defeats Saladin in the Battle of Arsuf in the desert, but he fails to take Jerusalem because Saladin is too well supplied. He can't rally enough support. The French withdraw. He's left with not a lot of men, and he has to agree to basically a ceasefire. Saladin, the warrior of Islam, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, is benevolent in his rule, and he agrees to allow pilgrims to come to Jerusalem, but he will not surrender the city. And that's the end of the Third Crusade. Richard makes his name, becomes the Lionheart, but fails in the objective. And when he's making his way back, his rivals throughout Europe start plotting against him, and they ambush him, kidnap him, and they deliver him over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who keeps him imprisoned for grudges, pettiness, for a whole year, and demands what's known as a king's ransom, which would be billions in today's money, and forces the Kingdom of England to scrape together this to pay him. And who's looking after England while he's been in the Crusades? If you've ever seen any Robin Hood movies, you'll know it's Prince John. Now, Prince John always wanted to be the king. He was his father's favourite, but he was the youngest. And when Richard came to the throne, he had this horrible nickname that was given to him called Lackland. You don't have any land, son. You've got chuff all. Imagine rubbing that in. Not only are not the heir, you've got no chuffing castles either. And Richard has got everything. You can see why he hated him. And so eventually, Richard comes back to find England in a right state. John's put all his favourites in these positions. He were entrusted to keep the realm in order, but he's fallen out with everyone. He's fallen out with the church. People are against him. John still thinks he should be the king. King of France has come back early from the Crusades, and John's been having a word with him. You know, some of these lands in France that Richard owns, you know, they really should be French, and they've been plotting together. Richard returns, stabilises the kingdom, gives John a crack round head, and then has to go to France because while Richard's been imprisoned, the King of France felt backed by John, or didn't give a monkey's what anyone thought, and he's retaken a load of land from Richard in France. So Richard goes to war with King of France, who used to be his ally, and he's taking castles, and he's taking one after the other. And what happens to him? After 5 years of hard fighting, now Richard's a great warrior, but he were never one for his own personal safety, and he leaves himself exposed in one of these sieges. And legend has it that a young boy who's just on the battlements of one of these French castles shoots a crossbow, hits him right through the neck. The great King Richard is killed by a child, by a crossbow bolt, out of the blue. And as he's dying, he orders the armies infuriated. They storm the castle, take the castle, find the young lad who fired the bolt, and Richard, who's dying, orders he's brought before him, and he pardons him. And the story goes is that boy thinks he's safe. Soon as King dies, all his followers make sure he meets a very horrible end. They're not having it. You killed our king. You killed our beloved King Richard, and that young lad paid the price for it. And we have a new king back in England in 1199. We have King John, who is no King Richard, and from the years 1200 to 1204 loses Normandy and most of his French lands. Philip just takes them off him. What's John going to do? He's no war leader, and we know Richard, to stop him, just takes all these possessions in France. Then John falls out with the Pope because he's trying to interfere in church business in England. And so that means that Pope Innocent III places England under interdict, which means that there's going to be a ban on all church practices. You're not allowed to worship in public, no masses, no weddings, no burials on consecrated ground, only basic rites like baptizing young kids, confessions for the dying. That's the only thing that's allowed. And what it did was it basically cut off England, the English people, from God. And that was the Pope's way of forcing the people of England to blame their ruler. So that's the power that the church had, and it works. Everybody hates King John now, particularly the barons. Now, the barons are the lords who run all the castles. And the barons don't get on with Prince John for a couple of reasons. One of them, the first reason is John, to get back in good graces of the Pope and buy his way back into the Catholic Church, because he's been excommunicated and England's been cut off, he sells England to the Pope and agrees to become the vassal of Pope Innocent III. So the Pope is now the overlord of England. So it's a massive humiliation for all the barons and lords living in England that their king has got out such good graces with the Pope that they got interdicted in the first place, banned and excommunicated, and now he's had to sell the whole lot. But the second reason is King John had demanded that they all pay taxes because he just tried to retake all his lands back off Philip in France, and it had been a disaster. He were a crap military commander, and so he massively whacks up all the taxes against the barons. He takes land off them if they don't agree, and eventually they say, right, stuff you, we're rebelling against you. And basically John backs down, and in 1215 there is a pivotal moment in English history when the barons force John to accept what's called the Magna Carta at a place called Runnymede in the south of England. Now, the Magna Carta established that the law applies to everybody, and the king is not above it. So the king can't just tax you when he wants, take your lands off you whenever he feels like it. He can't act above the law. And it were meant to protect them from getting locked up whenever they disagreed with him. And before he raises any taxes, he's got to have it agreed by what's called a Common Council. And it becomes one of the most important documents in English history. And King John agrees to it, seals it. The king is not above the law, and he has to work within the bounds of the law. 1215, the Magna Carta is sealed. But guess what? John turns his back on him. Had his fingers crossed the entire time he was sealing it. And what's more, it's not really John's decision to make, because his overlord is now the Pope. And as soon as the Pope hears about the Magna Carta, the Pope rejects it, says, no, I'm not accepting it because I rule England now. So I'm not authorising anything that John accepts. So I'm not having it. Barons are furious. And the First Barons' War kicks off. And barons are absolutely infuriated by this. In fact, they're that peed off with it. They don't want John as king anymore. And they invite the French Prince Louis to take the throne of England, which is unthinkable. Everyone hates the French, and it's decided they prefer to have the French prince. It's utterly scandalous. But they prefer him or anybody over John. But then, in the midst of it all, John, hated by all, dies, leaving his heir, Henry, behind. And he is cared for by the greatest knight that's ever been, called William Marshall. William Marshall takes the young lad, the young Henry, the son of the king, and presents him to the barons who are loyal to John and says, this is your king now. John is dead. Long live the king. And we have Henry III, who is the king of England. And William Marshall rallies the barons together. They join behind Henry III and they kick out Prince Louis. So we were a hair's breadth away from having the French king ruling over England again, just like William did. But to be quite honest, our kings in this period, pretty much French anyway. But this man, William Marshall, I mean, he goes on. He's absolutely amazing. He's a legend with a capital L. And he's technically served five kings. He served Henry II, then Henry the Young King, who was crowned but never really had any power, then Richard the Lionheart, King John, and now Henry III. He's like in his 70s when he leads the war against Prince Louis. He's like in the vanguard, which is the front of the battle line, like charges. I mean, 70-year-old should have been, collecting his pension, his bus pass and what have you. Absolutely amazing hero, William Marshall. Died in his 70s as well. Tough me in this day and age. So that's where we'll end part one. See you soon. Welcome back to part two of the Gist-ory channel, where we might not be able to give you the whole story, but we'll at least give you the gist. In the previous part, we were speaking about King John, who was a rubbish king of England. He's died, and his son, Henry III, is now the king. He's being protected by the greatest knight there's ever been, William Marshall, but he's in his 70s and he dies shortly afterwards. I mean, he's had a right innings. But young Henry III comes to the throne at the age of 9. So when these days most 9-year-olds are watching K-pop Demon Hunters, he's got a whole kingdom that's in tatters to get back together. The First Barons' War is over, and the kingdom gets somewhat stabilised by our old mate William Marshall when he defeats the young French pretender, Prince Louis, that the barons had wanted to install when they hated Prince John at the Battle of Lincoln, and they throw the support now behind King Henry III. In 1220, Henry III is coronated at Westminster Abbey to make him legitimate, and in 1225, the barons, sort of thinking that the dust has settled a little bit, come back with the Magna Carta that's slightly changed. It's not as harsh as in its wording as it was with King John, and they're like, fancy giving this a signature? And Henry does sign it. Henry III signs it. And then in 1227, a couple of years after, when he's 20 years old, he becomes the actual king. He assumes the role and ends what's called the regency. A regency is where someone's looking after kingdom for the king because he was too young. He gets married to Eleanor of Provence and tries to get everything back into a state of order. So he agrees like the boundary of the Anglo-Scottish border with King Alexander of Scotland. There's constant tensions with the King of France. He's trying to rebuild the mess of what King John left him. The Pope's still of the assumption that England's a vassal kingdom of the papacy and demands tributes as the overlord. Henry does honour these, but over the years it does kind of get watered down, does this obligation. It just shows you what a rubbish state King John left the kingdom in. No wonder he gets vilified in every Robin Hood movie. But Henry starts to get involved in Scotland a bit more, and when Alexander II's son dies, the King of Scotland, he appoints guardians for the young King of Scotland, Alexander III. Now, this is quite important where the King of England has gotten involved in appointing positions in the Kingdom of Scotland. Watch this space, particularly when Henry's son comes to the throne and has a bit of a ding-dong with the Scots. Well, the ding-dong of all ding-dongs. However, the barons, having got the Magna Carta signed and ratified by Henry, they now approach him with a new charter to sign, which is called the Provisions of Oxford. So this is in 1258, and I don't know what they're thinking. I think they're thinking, well, we've gained a bit of ground. King John was horrible, but his son signed the Magna Carta, so we'll see if we can get some more rights for us lords. And in a nutshell, the Provisions of Oxford are a response to Henry III's failings. So everything wasn't absolutely sweetness and lights with Henry III. He wasn't the best with managing money. England's pretty much bankrupt. It's had to pay out so many times. He's started to get a reputation of having some favourites at court, which really annoys the barons who are already here. They're usually foreign favourites as well. He's kept the high taxes that his dad put in, and there's all sorts of accusations of him being corrupt and, it's going into more his pocket to make him more extravagant and get more splendour and what have you. And it's a baron. The leader of the barons emerges as someone called Simon de Montfort, who presents these provisions of Oxford, and it's proposed in the provisions that a council of barons would effectively run the government and advise and oversee the king, that there would be a parliament to meet 3 times a year to ensure that there is scrutiny over the king's actions, and that anyone who is appointed to a high office has to swear allegiance to not only the king, but the barons as well, which would massively reduce the king's personal control over the kingdom. But we see the barons are starting to say, we need more of a say in the running of this kingdom. It's not just going to be you. We don't want another King John on our hands or anyone tyrannical. You have to run stuff by us. And this gets presented to the king. And when people hear what's in these provisions of Oxford, all round Europe, they're all saying, would I chuff accept that if that were my kingdom? And King Louis, the Ninth of France, is reported as saying, I'd rather break clods behind a plough than rule under such constraints. So, how can Henry III accept these? Well, very much like King John, he accepts it at face value, but then goes against it when he sends it to the Pope and says, look what they're trying to do now to your kingdom. Remember, it's your kingdom. And Pope says, well, I didn't accept the Magna Carta. That's an illegal document, and so are these provisions of Oxford. So Henry turns round to the barons, sticks 2 fingers up at him, and goes, not accepting it. And what does Simon de Montfort do? He goes to war with him again. And we have the Second Barons' War that kicks off in 1264. Now, de Montfort is no slouch, and he wins the first major battle, which is called the Battle of Lewes. And not only does he win it, he wins it decisively and captures Henry III, who's on the battle, but also captures Henry III's young son, Prince Edward, who would become known as the Longshanks because he's so tall and he is an absolute. He's cut in the same cloth as, say, someone like Richard the Lionheart. He is a right warrior. He is absolutely top class at running military campaigns, at fighting. He's not one to be messed with either. Doesn't suffer fools. And so Simon de Montfort basically becomes the uncrowned King of England, and he's running it with a council of barons, and it's like a parliament's running. He's got the country. He's got King locked up, his heir locked up, but then disaster. Prince Edward escapes captivity and rallies support behind him. And there is a massive climactic battle of the Second Barons' War called the Battle of Evesham. And it's said that the battle plan of the forces, the royalist forces, so Prince Edward's army, who's fighting against Simon de Montfort, who's got his dad, King Henry III, in prison. The objective of King Prince Edward was to kill Simon de Montfort no matter what, because you cut the head off the snake and the rest will follow. And so, in the Battle of Evesham, a group of knights just targets Simon de Montfort, charges towards him, hacks him to death in the middle of this climactic cavalry charge, and the battle is absolutely over. The Second Barons' War is over. Simon de Montfort is done, and Prince Edward claims victory. Henry III is obviously released, but everyone knows Prince Edward's the one who won this, and Henry's seen as a bit of a wet fart of a king, to be honest. Prince Edward's just known for being no nonsense at all, which we'll go on to find out. But I mean, when they've killed Simon de Montfort and crushed his army at the Battle of Evesham, they mutilate his body and send his head back to his wife. Absolutely brutal. That's in 1265. And then in 1266, the rest of the barons surrender, and the rebel barons are allowed to buy back all their lands from the king. So the lands got confiscated, obviously, when the barons rebelled for the Second Barons' War, and it's like, yeah, you can have them back, just pay for the whole thing. It's over totally in 1267, and there are some concessions that get signed because you've got to try and ensure a peace afterwards. But what Simon de Montfort had managed to do, even though he came to a very, very grim end, was when he was running the Parliament very briefly, when he was on top in the Second Barons' War, he like established things that we recognise today in England, like a House of Lords that discussed laws amongst the Lords, and the House of Commons, where the common people could discuss their issues to do with the government. And some reforms that he introduced were accepted by the royals when they came back in. So, yes, it was a failure, but it did contribute towards positive steps that we've got today. In 1272, Henry III dies, and he's succeeded by his son Edward, who becomes Edward the First, known as the Longshanks because of his height. And this is a king who will not accept any trace of or hint of rebellion against him. He's very much like Richard the First because he's a great warrior king, but he is not the benevolent kind. He is not particularly a nice man at all. And he just 100% believes in his authority as a king and believes in getting that authority, you need to crush people. So there's no time wasted, really. I mean, in 1277, so he's been on the throne for what, 5 years? He begins the conquest of Wales. And there's fighting over the years against Dafydd ap Gruffydd, who claims to be the last Prince of Wales. He's the grandson of Llewellyn the Great, and he's trying to establish some independence for the Welsh, fighting against the English overlords. And Edward just crushes Welsh resistance once and for all by building a succession of castles in Wales. If you go to Wales today, there's the most castles you can find anywhere throughout Britain, and this is because Edward the First built so many to control the population. We discussed how the Normans did the same thing. Well, Edward just absolutely crushes any Welsh resistance, and when he's conquered Wales, he takes like the crown, the coronet of the Prince of Wales, which is the highest position of the Welsh, and claims it for himself. And he ends up bestowing the title Prince of Wales onto his son, Edward II, which is something that tends to be a tradition in today's world. So the monarch in England, whether it be a king or queen, their successor, their heir, is usually bestowed the title Prince of Wales. And this is where it starts. In 1290, he's known for expelling the Jews from England. Jewish people in medieval society are known for dealing with money because they are able to loan people money and make a business out of it by charging interest. So this is something that's outlawed in the Catholic Church because they say that it's usury. You're not allowed to lend money to people and expect to make a profit from it. So you're not allowed to have interest placed on loans. Well, Jews were not constrained by that, and they were able to loan loads of money. Now, what would happen is people in these day and age, in this medieval time, didn't have any scruples, so they'd ask for huge loans off Jewish people and then just not pay them back. And then when the Jewish community would like kick off about it, when are you going to pay me my stuff back? If they were powerful lords or what have you, they could start all these old prejudices against the Jews. It's just absolutely awful slurs against the Jewish community. And tensions rise and rise and rise to the point where people demand that the king does something about them, under pressure from the church as well. And then what happens in 1290, uh, Edward the expels all the Jews from England. And this is just music to the ears of from people who've like got unpaid loans to them and all this sort of stuff, and they get expelled. And I'm afraid, I'm very sad to say that this is not the first time the Jews have been persecuted like this, and it will definitely not be the last. Edward I turns his attentions to Scotland in 1296. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, this is it. This is Edward I against the Scottish people. Now, this whole situation arises when the King of Scotland dies without a son, and they're all fighting amongst themselves at Scots as to who's going to be the next successor. There's about 13 claimants to the throne, and because they're all killing each other, they're never getting anything sorted out, and Scotland's going to be thrown into anarchy. They appeal to King Edward I to decide. Basically, you're a huge power, and what you can ensure that whoever gets nominated to be the king, none of these other candidates are going to kick off against them because they'll have the backing of you. And unfortunately, they've made a grave error here because Edward is interested in this, but it's like they've invited a wolf inside their sheep pen, and then they're surprised when the wolf eats all the sheep. Because Edward says, I will decide who the king will be. I'll sort this out for you and I'll show that they succeed the throne with no issues. Only you have to accept that England, i.e., me, the King of England, is the overlord of Scotland. And they're like, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, over the years, we've always had conflicts and England's tend to have ended out on top and there's been intermarriages and things like that. And I just need you to accept that I am your overlord. I'm just your protector. And they say, well, I suppose so. He says, that's my condition. So anyway, they end up agreeing to, well, fair enough. Okay, you're our protector, you're our overlord. Okay, just pick a king. So Edward says, all right, I pick this person. And it ends up being someone called John Baloyle, who is he's got the best claim, to be fair. I think he's one of the grandsons of the former king. But his main rival it came down to two, and his main other rival was someone called Robert Bruce Senior, who is the father of who would be someone called Robert the Bruce, who is the more famous of the family, but he's to come later. So anyway, John Baloyle becomes King of Scotland, and then as soon as he's sort of crowned, Edward speaks to him and says, right, congratulations, you're the King of Scotland. So I'll expect you in my court whenever I call you, and I want you to run by all your decisions by me. If any decisions you make I don't like, I'm going to overturn them, and if I can have a bit of tribute every now and again, happy days. John Baloyle's like, what are you talking about? We're an independent kingdom. He says, well, mate, I'm sorry, I'm your overlord, and you went for that deal. I've made you a king, so I'm your overlord. You're my vassal. And he's like, what are you talking about? We're an independent kingdom. He says, of course you're an independent kingdom, as long as you do what I say. And so King John goes back to Scottish. They're having none of it, and they rebel against the king and King Edward. And King Edward, I think, was expecting this reaction because he just absolutely rolls into Scotland and smashes everything to bits. I mean, he just absolutely he earns the nickname the Hammer of the Scots because he just plunders the whole place, claims it for himself, crushes any opposition, and even takes from Scotland, from Perth in Scotland, the ancient Stone of Destiny, which is their ancient stone where all the kings of Scotland get crowned. And he takes it back to England because he is now the king of Scotland as well, and he to this day the kings and queens of England are crowned on a throne that underneath it has the Stone of Destiny, which is also known as the Stone of Scone. And this harps back to when Edward I took it. There you go. History is just permeating through modern life, and we don't even know it. So during these Scottish wars, looks like Scotland is under the thumb of England until there is a Scottish patriot who rises up and rallies the common people behind him. And this is someone who we all should have at least heard of, called William Wallace. And he fights back against the English because everyone's like deciding in Scotland, should we just submit to him? Should we give up? And William Wallace is the one who makes the decision for him. We're not giving up at all. We're going to fight back. And in 1297, there's a pitched battle at Stirling Bridge, which I've recently been to, and in the film, it gets it massively wrong because it's a fight on an open field in the film, but in real life, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the bridge is really crucial because what happens is William Wallace and his army are waiting at one side of the bridge, and as the English are coming over the bridge, they're in like a big line because like their army's like coming over the bridge, and the Scots attack when they're like halfway over. So what that means is that they can fight half the army, and the rest of the army can't get over because they're trying to all get over the bridge, the narrow bridge, and Scots end up annihilating them. And I mean, in the film, it's fantastic because I love Patrick McGowan, who plays Longshanks in the film. He's an Irish actor, actually, but there's a scene where they've just lost the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and he's been away in France, and he comes to see Edward, his son, Edward II, who's the Prince of Wales. He says, "What news of the North?" And Prince Edward's saying, "Nothing yet. We haven't heard anything yet." And he fully knows that the army's been wiped out. And Longshanks says, "I heard the news in France, where I was fighting to expand your future kingdom. And the word has it, my son, that our entire northern army is annihilated. We've done nothing." And then he ends up throwing Piers Gaveston out the window. "Who is this person who speaks to me as though I needed his advice?" I mean, that's just me indulging myself doing that impression, but what performance that was! By the way, Piers Gaveston does become a favourite of Prince Edward II, but he doesn't die in that way. He doesn't get thrown out the window by Edward I. So anyway, we've got victory for the Scots under William Wallace. William Wallace gets knighted as High Protector of Scotland, and this time Edward comes in person to defeat the Scots, which he does at the Battle of Falkirk. Basically, Edward has brought archers, he's brought heavy cavalry, and the way that the Scots usually defended themselves was they used to like band together in a shield wall sort of tactic in a circle. It was called a Shilton. And they were defending themselves like that against cavalry charges. But the gist of it is the English used their archers to thin out their ranks so that obviously people were dying. There were gaps in the Shiltrons. And then as soon as there were enough gaps, they'd bottled them up into a corner, by the way. Edward ordered his cavalry to charge. And when you're not locked together and what have you, and you've been peppered by arrows, they ended up losing, did Scots. Eventually, after a guerrilla war, William Wallace is captured. He is hung, drawn, and quartered. That's shown brutally in the film. He's that basically means that once you've been executed, this is the penalty for treason. So you get hung until you're nearly dead. You get drawn, so your insides get taken out in front of you, sometimes burned in front of you, and then you're beheaded. But then you're split into quarters, so your arms, your head gets taken off, your and all your arms and limbs and what have you get taken off, and they got sent to different parts of the kingdom and hung up as a sign. You rebel against me, and this is what happens against you. This is the punishment for treason. And in 1307, Edward I dies. He's on campaign. The Scots are starting to rebel again, and on his way up to fight the Scots, he gets dysentery, which is the bloody flux, the bloody diarrhea, due to poor hygiene, which was rife in those times. And he dies on campaign, and his son, Edward II, takes the throne. Now, Edward II is known as not being really warlike at all. He's no sort of battle commander, particularly not in the same league, not in the same planet as Edward I. But he takes over, and he relies on favourites a lot, like we spoke of Piers Gaveston. I have to be careful not to call him Gaviscon, which is it's a brain fart of mine. But he is married to Isabella of France. And now this was an attempt from Edward I to stop France from interfering with Scotland because they kept back in Scotland. Obviously, England and France were always fighting each other. So he marries Edward II, his son, to Isabella of France, who would eventually become known as the She-Wolf of France because she was very fierce. But she's played by Sophie Marceau in Braveheart, who is very, very nice. But back to the story. So Edward II is having to deal with all sorts of tension from his barons and his lords about his favouritism of Piers Gaveston, and they threaten to rebel against him. and they basically force Edward II, because they know he's not as formidable as Edward I, to exile Piers Gaveston. Edward initially agrees, but then recalls him in 1311 and just defies the barons. So the barons just find Piers Gaveston where he's hiding and kill him. Now, if that's not just utter disrespect against the king, I don't know what is. It just shows you they're not worried about this guy at all. They're not worried about Prince Edward's wrath, not like they were with Edward I, his father. And in 1314, the tensions with the Scots come to a head when there's the Battle of the Bannockburn. Now, this is Edward II against Robert the Bruce, the son of one of the claimants, who has been on the run from the English. He's become an outlaw. There's a great film called Outlaw King that's got Christopher Pine playing Robert the Bruce. And at the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scots defeat the English decisively, and they're outnumbered, but they're just cleverer and they're just better fighters than the English. The English come with more men, as they usually did, but like the Bannockburn's a river that they put like pikes and sticks and stakes in it. So when the English try and get over it, they end up like stabbing their horses and all this sort of stuff. The charge fails. There's apparently a single combat between the English commander and Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce avoids a lance charge from this commander. This is just in front of everybody, just them in single combat, and then he cleaves his head in two with an axe. So this will show you how formidable Robert the Bruce is. And then the English they try and do a sneak attack outside at Scots by crossing Bannockburn at a point further down, end up camping out on this boggy, horrible, like bottleneck of land that the Bannockburn curves around. Try and attack the Scots. Scots are too disciplined, and then eventually just push them back into this bottleneck and just massacre them all. English are utterly defeated, sent home packing with a tail between their legs. And things only get worse for Edward II because he gets a new favourite called Hugh Despenser, who, very much like Piers Gaveston, is hated by the barons because he uses his friendship with the king to seize loads of lands off these barons who he thinks are, or he convinces the king are being disloyal to him, particularly in what's called the Welsh Marches, which is the land between England and Wales. And there is a huge war that breaks out called the Despenser War, where barons revolt again against the Despensers. But the Despensers are defeated, and Hugh Despenser gets hung, drawn, and quartered for treason and meets a very, very grisly death. During this time, Edward II and his wife, Isabella of France, end up hating each other. There are rumours that these favourites that Edward II has had is because he was homosexual. I suppose it's entirely likely. Marriages were made in these days not for love, but for alliances. And Isabella of France uses an excuse of going on a diplomatic mission to France in 1325 to leave England and not come back. And not only does she not come back, but she ends up in an affair with one of Edward's lords called Roger Mortimer, who was one of Hugh Despenser's rivals when he was nicking all the Welsh marcher lords' castles. Roger Mortimer was involved in the Despenser War, and I suppose it all comes to a head when in 1326 Queen Isabella of France and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invade England and defeat Edward II. Everyone just sort of abandons him. He gets captured. He gets forced into prison at a place in Berkeley Castle, which is in Gloucestershire, and he is executed. Now, there are questions as to how he got executed. One of the stories is there was a red hot poker shoved up somewhere where the sun doesn't shine, but that might have been a slur against him and the rumours, obviously, of being homosexual, which was vilified in these these ages. But some people say that's just a fallacy and wishful thinking for a more dramatic story, and that he was just executed in the quietest way possible, a little garrote round the neck or something. But he's dead, and who takes over? It's not his son with Isabella, who was a young lad called Edward. It was Isabella and Roger Mortimer, and Roger Mortimer, who obviously being a male believes, as did society, that they are more important than women in these day and ages. He basically acts like he's the king when he's got the Queen of France by his side. No, Queen Isabella of England, Isabella of France by his side. But even when he's round the king to be, he's meant to be a regent. He walks in front of the young Prince Edward, who's going to be the king, makes decisions as if he's the king, wants people to treat him like he's the king, like he'll sit on the throne and make sure people address him as Your Grace and all this sort of stuff. And he ends up, him and Isabella, being just as hated as Edward was, the second. And in 1330, the young Prince Edward, who's 17 years old, has had enough. And he's like, right, I'm taking over the throne now. This is taking Mick. And Roger Mortimer and Isabella of France, the mother of Prince, are in Nottingham Castle. And it's all protected by their guards, and there's no way in, and it's a fortress. However, there is one secret entrance which is still there today for you all to see. And through this secret tunnel, Edward and his followers, a group of knights that he's got with him, go on like a James Bond style mission, like the A Team, to get into this castle, something like what the SAS would do, and they arrest Roger Mortimer and his mother, Queen Isabella, and it's still there. It's known as Mortimer's Hole. Is this secret entrance? And yeah, Roger Mortimer is hung. Edward III becomes the king in 1330 at the age of 17, and he imprisons his mother, Isabella of France. And we are now in the age of King Edward III. And we will end that as the end of part two. Flipping heck, we have gone through so much. But in part three, we will be talking about King Edward III, the start of the Hundred Years' War. See you after the break. Welcome back to part three of our episode on the medieval period and the Plantagenet Kings of England. This is part of our story of Britain, and we have a new king. In 1330, Edward III overthrows Roger Mortimer, his mother's lover, and imprisons his mother, Isabella of France, and he begins his solo reign. And this Edward III is what we think of when we think of a medieval king. He is in the same mold as the warrior kings before him. He leads from the front, he's a battle commander, and most importantly, he is the one who starts the Hundred Years' War in 1337. The Hundred Years' War against France, because it goes on for 100 years, if not more and more. France has always been a rival of England ever since the Normans came and took it over, because it took England over. Because basically, let's face it, it's two French dynasties fighting over each other as to who's going to rule England. And the England is the English people being ruled over by a French family. First, it was William the Conqueror, and then it moved on to the Plantagenets. And this Hundred Years' War is where it officially starts in earnest. We've had so many battles with the French before of the English, but Edward III claims, because my mother is Isabella of France, the daughter of the French king, through her I claim the right to be the king of France. I want the whole job lot, the whole kit and caboodle. So the Hundred Years' War starts when he declares war on France and he wants to take the French throne. So we have a number of significant battles that happen in here that define the English in the medieval period. The first one is the Battle of Crecy in 1346. Now, this is where the English longbow comes to the fore, because it's made English law that every person must practice the longbow. You must be able to fire a longbow. And so we have some of the greatest archers in the world, and the longbow, which originated in Wales, is everyone as bows have been around as long as there's been wars, but the longbow is a special design. It's exactly as it sounds. It is longer than a usual bow. The draw weight is a lot more than a usual bow, and it can fire further and more accurately than regular bows. So we get famed, the English, for the longbow, and it dominates battles. Most medieval warriors are all about jousting and charging into battle, whereas the English, they have their knights too, but mostly they rely on the longbows. And what they tend to do, the English, is they rely on dismounted knights who protect the longbowmen against cavalry charges from the French, and just allow the longbows to just cut through the ranks of the French knights. And this is what happens at Crecy. Another thing that comes out of the Battle of Crecy is we get introduced on the main stage to the son of Edward III, who's known as Edward, confusing, but he's known as the Black Prince. And when he is 16 years of age, he leads the vanguard of the English at Crecy, which is the people who are in the thick of the fighting. It's on the rightmost of the battle line, and he, at 16 years old, manages to make a name for himself and win that clash in the vanguard. Becomes massively famous, really revered by everyone for his efforts. And it's a bit disputed as to why he's called the Black Prince. A lot of people think it's because he wore a suit entirely of black armor, which sounds pretty cool. But there's also a theory that he's known as the Black Prince because of what happened in the Battle of Poitiers. Now, that comes in 1356, which is another huge victory for the English. Now, we have to discuss something that the English were known for, and the French, but mostly the English. Now, got to understand that the French are fighting on in France, but the English have come over, so from England, so they tend to have smaller armies, which are knights and mostly longbowmen. And what they would do, the English, is they would complete what's called a chevauchée in French. And that basically means you destroy and raid and pillage and burn down everything you can in the countryside. You kill innocent people. So you march through, you kill innocent people, you steal all their stuff, all the tributes that they'd be giving to their French lords, all the money they'd be giving to their French lords. So not only do you just ransack like a group of barbarians across the land, you end up feeding your men, you end up satisfying their base urges by like they get loot and money, but it also terrorizes the population into thinking that the French can't protect them. And this is designed to make the French come out of the castles and try and chase you down. And this is what tends to happen when the English complete the chevauchée, and it happens with the Battle of Poitiers. So the Black Prince, Edward the Black Prince, is doing the chevauchée through France. The French king and lords can't deal with it anymore, and so they send out an army to chase him. And it's exactly what he wants. So he picks favourable ground, tells his men to turn round, dig in, and the longbows just annihilate this French army that's out in the open. And so he's won two really significant victories for the English, Crecy, Poitiers. But there is another significant event that happens during the Hundred Years' War. In 1348 to 1350, England suffers the Black Death, which is the bubonic plague. Now, this will have a massive impact because we all went through COVID. Well, just imagine that, but with more rats, more boils, and more people puking the guts up until they die piled up in the streets. Horrendous. It's horrific. People dying, they have no cure for it. They try and protect people as much as they can, but it's just ravaging through the population. This will have a massive effect later on in the later kings because people are just dying by their thousands and thousands in the countryside. So you don't have people in the fields. You have this war going on with France, so people are getting taxed massively. But by the middle of the 1350s, the plague naturally sort of starts to ebb off. People start to get some sort of immunity to it, to this strain of it, but it devastates the populations, and still this war rages on. So by 1360, the war starts to slow down, And when the war slows down, you've got to concentrate on what's happening back at home. And these issues start raising their head. People have died from this plague, the Black Death. No one's got any money because they keep getting taxed. I mean, the elites can have all the glory, and the soldiers of fortune can have all the glory doing the chevauchées throughout France, pillaging it, all it so that Edward III can call himself the King of France. I mean, he creates like great positions like Knights of the Garter, and he's celebrated as a great king. But it's as always in these wars, it's the populations who suffer. So you've got the Black Death, you've got pillaging, rampaging armies. It's just horrendous. And on top of that, we have the start of what will become a huge crisis when the son of the king, the Black Prince, either due to because he wears black armor or because of his brutal tactics in France, he's revered by the English people, but he dies, believed to be again of dysentery. The bloody flux, poor hygiene, what have you, in this day and age. He dies in 1376. He was the main heir. He was going to carry on the legacy, the glorious legacy of Edward III. And in 1377, Edward III dies. So, who becomes the king? Edward III has had about five children, one of them being the Black Prince, who died. But then he's got other brothers. So, does it go to the brothers, or does it go to the son, which it eventually does, of the Black Prince? It goes to Richard, who is named Richard II at the age of 10. So it goes to the grandson of Edward III. And Richard II is a Plantagenet king. He is named king in 1377, and he is 10 years old, and he has to deal with all the fallout now from still the Hundred Years' War, still ongoing. But he's also got to deal with what the results of the Black Death and the high taxation and what have you. And the peasantry have had enough. These issues haven't been resolved. People are still getting taxed because the English crown wants to keep going to war with France, but no one's dealing with the aftermath of the Black Death. And to try and save as much money as they can, the government frees the wage rates of workers to the time before the Black Death. Because what happens is, because there's such a shortage of people, the peasants think, right, well, I can make more money being a carpenter or a fletcher for arrows or a blacksmith or a farmer by charging more for me goods because there's more demand for it and there's not as much supply, and I can benefit somewhat from this devastating disaster. But the government say, no, you're not raising your prices, everything has to remain the same. And all of this accumulates in the peasants who have got nothing. They're being taxed into oblivion. They're starving. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt breaks out against the king and the government. And it's led by someone called Wat Tyler, who is the leader of the Peasants' Revolt. And they storm through London. And when the peasants uprise, they outnumber the elites 100 to 1. They all hide inside Tower of London. King has to hide inside Tower of London. And peasants are threatening to break in. In fact, they do slightly break in and they murder some tax collectors in there. So, I mean, people are deciding, what do we do? Do we just get the army, recall it from France, and just murder all of our people? And it's the 14-year-old Richard II who said, let me talk to him. So he does. He ends up negotiating with the rioters, with the peasants. And he meets them at Mile End, which is a place in London, very famous. You can still go there today. And he meets with Wat Tyler, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt. And he hears their grievances, shows sympathy with them, and agrees to their demands, which is he abolishes serfdom, which requires the peasants have to work for the lord of the land. They're effectively freeing the peasants from that obligation. They've obviously killed these tax collectors. They've revolted against their king. He offers to pardon them all. He offers to reduce the rents for any sort of if they are on land that belongs to a lord, or they do owe their lord some rents. He's agreed to lower them. And what he essentially does is he convinces them that I'm on your side, I'm for you. I know you've had such a hard time of it, but just get behind me as your king, and obviously go back to your homes, and I will be the king you want. And they agree to it for a day, but then the next day they decide, well, actually, you kind of agreed to everything we wanted. We want to see what else we can get. And they met again at Smithfield, and this is another place in London. But this time they overplayed their hand. They were like saying, right, we want lordship to be completely abolished. So there's no lords of the land anymore. We want all the church land to be confiscated, and it needs to be distributed among the common people. And this were outrageous. I mean, King Richard, 14-year-old kid, the second, he's trying to appeal to them, but the people who are with him are saying this is absolutely taking the Michael now. They're absolutely taking pee out of you. And Wat Tyler starts acting quite aloof. I think he got a bit overconfident, or he's interpreted as maybe treating the king with disrespect, and someone takes exception to it, and I think grabs hold of him. A fight starts out in front of King while they're discussing this, and Wat Tyler is arrested. And all peasants are there, obviously, and this is where a tactic called kettling starts get to be developed. So instead of directly fighting with the peasantry, you kettle them in. So your forces, if you're outnumbered, you sort of block them off, um, allow this big body of people to like boil themselves out as if they were in a kettle. So you just follow them where they go, but just try and shepherd them along into a different area, and they eventually peter out, they run out of steam and what have you. But Wat Tyler is executed for what he's done, and order gets restored. The ringleaders of this revolt are killed, and everyone else is allowed to go back to their livelihoods. And everyone seems behind Richard the Second. It seems it's quite an amazing feat that he's managed to. I mean, it had a very messy end with Wat Tyler sort of overplaying his hand, but there's been some compromises. They believe that he is for the people, but he turns out to be a right wrong'un because he's the son of the Black Prince, so they expect great things out of him, but he is no warrior. He's petty and he's jealous of people. He's particularly jealous of his cousin, who is the son of one of Edward the Third's other sons. So that makes them cousins. And basically, he's called Henry Bolingbroke. Now, he's the son of the Duke of Lancaster, who's called John of Gaunt. Lancaster is a city in northern England that rules over Lancashire. And because they're all part of the Plantagenets, the emblem of the House of Lancaster is a red rose because it's Plantagenet. They're all about plants, they're all about sprig of bloom and what have you. So it's a red rose. Henry Bolingbroke is the son of John of Gaunt, and he is a great warrior. He is one of these people who Richard wishes he was. Everyone celebrates him. There's a story about how he's so great in tournaments, and everyone's whispering behind Richard's back. God, it'd be so great if Henry could have been the king rather than this wet blanket we've got, who's the grandson of Edward the Third, the son of the Black Prince. I mean, he's no warrior. He doesn't bring any glory to Rome. Rome, sorry, I'm in first episode again, to England. And as is the problem with any king of England, whenever there is the slightest problem, the barons start getting annoyed at Richard II. And so these rumours that, oh, it'd be great if Henry could have been king instead, because it was a bit of a disputed succession who was going to claim the throne after Edward III died. And Richard's really prickly, and he takes out these grievances on people, and he particularly wants some respect and authority. So throughout like 1390, he reasserts his authority, increases his autocratic rule, which is how you annoy the barons, which is what King John and Henry III did. He obviously doesn't learn from history. And between 1397 and 1398, he expels all his political rivals from the kingdom. So he identifies people who are causing unrest in the realm, and it's threatening the stability of England, and you can get out. We're not having you back. And particularly, he exiles who's his main target and the person he's most jealous of, Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin. Now, Henry Bolingbroke is in exile. His father, the Duke of Lancashire, John of Gaunt, dies. And in 1399, basically, Henry appeals to Richard II and says, right, well, my father's died. I know you've got me in exile, but I need to inherit his lands. I'm the Duke of Lancashire now. Richard II says, don't give a monkey's what you think. I'm confiscating the lands. You're not inheriting anything. You're exiled. You're never coming back. Which gives Henry Bolingbroke an excuse to invade England in what would be, I suppose, an extension of a Baron's Rebellion against Richard II, with the justification that he's a tyrant. He's not abiding by the Magna Carta, by the provisions of Oxford that were agreed, and he's just removed these lands from me that I'm entitled to. So in 1399, Henry Bolingbroke invades England, gets loads of support behind him from the nobles who were sick to death of Richard II abusing his power, particularly the Percy family, who rule the north of England. They, since the time of William the Conqueror, the De Percy family have been overlords of the north of England. With this support, Henry forces the surrender of Richard and imprisons him. He's imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and Henry declares himself King of England. He is Henry IV. He is the cousin of Richard II. Richard II is imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, which is not too far from where I'm speaking to you now, and he is reportedly starved to death. So he's not outrightly killed, but it's thought that through lack of looking after him, he's starved to death, which Henry, you could argue, I mean, he claimed he wasn't involved, but that needed to happen because whether you liked him or not, Richard was the king by the right of being descended from the eldest male line. But with the death of Richard II, that is the last of the Plantagenet kings from that unbroken line. And Henry Bolingbroke of the House of Lancaster is now the king, but he is a usurper. And in the next episode, we'll be exploring the Lancastrian kings that leads up to the War of the Roses that ends in the Tudors becoming the kings and queens of England. So that is our story of the Plantagenet kings. This is an extra long episode. Thank you for sticking with me. We've gone from the reign of Henry II through to Richard I. Then King John took the throne. His son, Henry III, took over. Then when he died, Edward I, Longshanks, Hammer of the Scots, was king. He died. Edward II became the king. Following him was his son, Edward III, who started the 100 Years' War. His son, the Black Prince, dies young, and so his grandson, Richard II, takes the throne. But as we've just heard, his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, takes the throne, usurps it from Richard, and is crowned Henry IV, ending the Plantagenet line. If you have enjoyed this episode, please give us a like. If you want more content, please subscribe to the Gist-ory channel. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this. Again, we've had a lot to get through, but I've enjoyed every minute of it. But I must say that as long as it's been, and as much as it's been fun, that is all the time we have. And this episode is now history. I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself. Ta-ra.